Good morning. Julian Dierkes here. Just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to try to cover with this Mongolia election update this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about how, in the end, the sort of alignment of parties, candidates, and procedures has shaken out. I'll give you a couple impressions from the campaign. Then I'm going to turn it over to Marissa Smith to talk about a comparison of the big pieces in the party platforms. Then BATBOLD is going to talk about specifically on mining policy, how the big parties compare. I'll finish up with a little bit of an outlook. Then we'll stop the recording and we'll go into Q&A, and hopefully that will be something like 35 minutes or so for our presentation, and that will leave us time for Q&A. So to get started, let me just acknowledge that I'm speaking to you, and BULGAN and I at least are speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here on the lower mainland on the west coast of North America. I think it's important to remember that, particularly at a time when we're also very concerned with structural racism and the continuing and lingering impact of colonialism. And so I want to be sure to acknowledge that we are uninvited guests on this territory here. Good, so we've had, since I spoke to you last week, we've had some more things finalized. The Election Commission has issued the IDs for candidates, and so we've got sort of the final setup now for the election. We have a total of 606 candidates. They're distributed across 13 parties and 4 coalitions, and then about 121 independents in addition to that. As candidates were approved in the end by the Election Commission, we only have 2 parties that are running full slates, and that's the dominant parties, the People's Party and the Democratic Party. They have 76 candidates, so they have a candidate for every seat. Whereas a number of the coalitions and one of the parties has a candidate in every electoral district. Recall that there's 29 districts and they are multi-member districts, so that they're distributed across these districts, the candidates are. We have 2,139,000 and some, I forget how many registered voters. And the candidates are distributed across those districts in that all the IMAGs, the more rural areas, have the first 18 districts, and we've got the sort of semi-urban areas of Dachan and Adenet, the 2 second cities, if you will, with a district each, and then the remainder of the districts, districts 21 through 29, are the Ulaanbaatar districts. Depending on how many people registered, we've got the lowest number of candidates is 10 per district, and the highest number is, I think it's in Sukhbatar, if I remember right, the central district in Ulaanbaatar, is 38 candidates competing for the 3 seats there. Just to note on the registered voters as well that Mongolia, as you all know, is a very young country, so we've got over 40% under 35, and so obviously not all of those are eligible voters. Oh no, I think that's actually 42% of the eligible voters, sorry, that excludes kids, so a predominantly young election. Just a quick note also on that photo, Bilik, who I think is listening in as well. She's a student at the National University of Mongolia, has been kindly sending me some pictures from the campaign, and so this is one of those, just to credit her for those pictures. So then if we go along, just a couple impressions. Obviously, this is a different experience for me. This is the first election in the last 6 national elections that I'm not in country. And so I'm trying to follow either directly on social media or by reports that I read in the Mongolian press. But just some quick impressions here. Obviously, this is a campaign that's unfolding under COVID-19 sort of circumstances. And so we do see lots of evidence of physical distancing, of masks. This clip here at the top right, I'm not going to show you the video, but this is Prime Minister Herzog, and you can see he's wearing his face shield. That seems to be his choice of protection. This video was actually a bit of a hit earlier in the week because he shooed away his security team saying, oh, the people will protect me. People at these rallies are wearing masks, but you can also see there's a lot of handshaking going on. So it's a bit of a mix where there's a lot of strict distancing going on, and then sometimes you wonder how real the distancing is. I've been impressed in the sense that the People's Party seems like a highly organized sort of a party campaign machine, not just the tourists themselves, but that the central party social media game is pretty strong. Prime Minister and party chair, of course, is traveling across the country, appearing with candidates the way you would expect the party chair to support their candidates, but also the candidates are obviously eager to host him in their ridings. And then they've been very active online with these kind of videos that this is a clip from, but lots of photos. They're actually using some hashtags too, something we haven't seen on Mongolian social media so much, at least on Twitter, which is mostly what I'm following. So it seems overall, it gives me the impression of a pretty coordinated and professional campaign. The DP, on the other hand, is a bit less visible, is my sense. There's some candidates that are quite active, but overall, it doesn't quite have that party presence in the way the MPP does. Party chair Erden does not appear to be very visible. He is appearing with some candidates, but not nearly in the same prominent way that someone like Huasuk is. And President Batdorj is also just sporadically sort of dipping in. There are a number of candidates that are very active online, and so they're obviously biasing my impression and perception of the election in the sense that I see lots of them, but maybe less so of other people. I've been keeping a list of candidates who are on Twitter, and I think I'm up to almost 100 out of the 600 are on Twitter, but that obviously doesn't mean that they're necessarily active. So the reason we're going to talk about the platforms in particular today is, if you skip to the next slide, BULGAN, the platforms, of course, have a legal status in Mongolia in a way that they don't in many countries, right? Because the platform has to be approved by the National Audit Office. And the approval is focused on the feasibility of the promises, proposals, policy ideas that show up in the proposal, in the platforms. And they are also binding to the candidate. So as an individual candidate, at least if you're nominated by a party, you cannot depart from the platform and its proposals as that's been audited. So just as a reminder that when we're focusing on the platforms today, that's particularly meaningful because of that legal requirement. So then let me pass it over to Marissa to tell us a little bit about some of the themes and main focus areas that have shown up in the platforms.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, so I just want to go quickly through these quickly because there's quite a few parties. But yeah, so first let's just start with the People's Party. So their slogan is "Unite the Force" is one way to translate it. It's actually not on any of these posters, but anyway. So they're the incumbent party, right? And they're coming in really, really strong. Can you go to the next slide, BULGAN? Okay, so they have like a fair number of, you'll see these same topics repeated in many of the platforms, of course. There's social policy, some things about governance, some things about environment. I'll just go through this a bit more in depth because a lot of the platforms have similar things, but highlight the more unique aspects. So yeah, there's talking about healthcare, there's talk about preventative healthcare, like everyone should have one sort of like annual physical, talking about schools and childcare, social insurance, reducing 70 to 80% of the air pollution. Actually, air pollution was not something I saw addressed in all of the platforms, which is kind of surprising, but maybe not, considering that people are going to be held in some fashion to these platforms. So also about that 70 to 80%, it was notable to me that the People's Party gave a lot of metrics, a lot of specific metrics, and I didn't see that in other platforms. Yeah, so this idea of using social insurance payment records as a loan collateral or deposits for first-time home buyers, that's also a very specific policy that the People's Party had that I didn't see in other platforms. Governance, of course, they want to implement these constitutional amendments. Their parliament just implemented them. If you're interested in learning more about that, there's a lot on the blog on Mongolia Focus. Strong cabinet, independent judiciary. So talking about reform of the judiciary was a very, that was another thing that was in a lot of the platforms that's pretty interesting. Some of the other platforms also talk about like directly electing judges. So just to note that, again, as sort of part of the overview. More unique thing here, increase army capacity, but also establish construction engineering units, which to me really harkens back to the socialist period. but also cybersecurity units, which is also something that Julian has been tweeting a lot about, and it's some more stuff on the blog. So there have been talks about having drones and things. So that's kind of an interesting combination there. Environment. So another very common thing in many of the platforms is this increased conservation on the one hand, right? And I see this number of 25, 27, 30% of the country being protected areas, which is something that should be familiar to people from, I think, back when it's like in the 2000s that sort of started coming up. And on the other hand, though, conservation, but then also kind of treating everything else as a natural resource, right? Herding, policy for the herding economy for herders is, you'll find that in different parts of the platforms, but sometimes you'll find it in the environment part, as is this case. And yeah, this providing some sort of funds for herders to reclaim pasture is a common feature. But there's not really any language about kind of how those funds would get to the herders or how they would get down to the more local levels of government. Also, a few of the parties, not all of them, talk about Gobi water projects and reviving these canal systems. And yeah, it's notable that the MPP also talks about specifically increasing the share of renewable energy to 25%. Also, I found, yeah, electrical infrastructure, energy infrastructure was a big part of a lot of the platforms, which I didn't quite expect. Okay, BULGAN, can you go to the next slide? Okay, also notable about the People's Party platform is these mega projects, and they use the word mega. And yeah, it was literally the language of finishing and completing Oyutolgoy and these railroads around Tavantolgoy, but also like starting new large projects. So the Askat silver mine in the west, but also these other large Gobi copper mines, including Sagan Silverug. I think there are two other ones, Harnaktai. But then also they were talking about starting the Egin Gold Dam and starting the railroad that is planned to go from Erdenet to Tuva to the Russian border. So yeah, that's pretty ambitious, and things that they've been working on for a while now. Some stuff about the wealth fund, invest no less than 1 trillion tugruks into this wealth fund. Also, just so I don't forget, the third parties do not say anything about like where the money for these programs is going to come from. This BATBOLD is going to speak more at length about the DP and the MPP proposals for, how do we get the mining wealth into a government fund and distributed. Also a note about the herding policies. So the MPP is talking very strongly about providing funding for industrialization of processing agricultural products and exporting them. There's not any language about like giving loans directly to herders. It's like if you get a loan to build a building to process materials, more like. Okay, and there was something about a progressive tax system. The only other party I saw talking about a tax reform of that kind was the Green Party, which actually wants to have like a sort of millionaire's tax. Okay, BULGAN, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so the DP, the Democratic Party. Yep, so here's a bit of their what their campaign looks like. Something else I found really notable, and I did a pretty comprehensive survey of Facebook profiles, and they're wearing like a uniform, right? They're wearing this like blue polo shirt and these blue caps, and there's also sort of like a blue vest. And there's a lot of presence on Facebook, but it's not, I would say it's uncoordinated. There's not a lot of evidence that it's sort of centrally coordinated by the party. Interestingly too, I found like some kind of ghost profiles where it looked like a sort of the promotional firm or whoever is running had set up a profile for this candidate, and it was just like a logo, like the DP logo, but there was like no content. So that was kind of interesting. But then I didn't really see any of the active users using any of that content that had sort of been put in there for them. So that's interesting. Okay, so yeah, so they identify themselves as a central right party. They talk a lot about human rights. I think people would be pretty familiar. Private market, people would be fairly unsurprised with the language they're using. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so interestingly, their platform talks about their COVID-19 response a lot and kind of launches into the discussion of economic programs from that. And yeah, so special programs to help people, help people and the economy recover from COVID. This is a fairly lengthy list of things, but yeah, provide direct funds to people, prioritize certain programs, job guarantees, things like that. Also, yeah, the special law to not bankrupt any companies is interesting. And then how do they maintain the economic growth? So supporting SMEs and innovative businesses. So some of you may remember the SME scandal. Talk about SMEs is pretty prominent in these platforms across the board, actually. Okay, please, next slide, BULGAN. Okay, and they have this program called Ezin Mongol, and I didn't translate that, but Ezin is this really interesting term that sort of means like an owner, but also a manager, and so it can refer to the sort of head of a family or the head of a business, or even, you know, the entities that control the sacred mountains and their environs. So anyway, that's their set of programs they have proposed, and they're talking a lot about balanced urban-rural development, regional development. This idea of regional development is also something that's been around for a long time, right? And they have 3 specific projects, but again, this was like pretty vague. They're talking about encouraging herders to be businessmen, literally. And they called the program Prosperous Herders, how I would translate it. It's this other word that they haven't used before that I've seen. And then also improve infrastructure in Zooms, but there wasn't any like specific language about how to actually grant more power to local Zooms that I saw, or even how the funding would work, but it's in there. And then also, yeah, like this development of these other parts of UB outlying areas, further developing Nalayak and Batdorj, but then, you know, building this airport city, and the Maidar eco city is also mentioned. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just some sort of lower priority areas. There's not much about judicial independence or police reform. The national security stuff is fairly familiar. They also talk about cybersecurity and AI. And the economic free trade zones. But again, that's sort of same old, same old. For the environment, you can see that they've been influenced by Otgonbayar, who's actually not running this year, is not in the race, but her toilet programs. Next slide, please. Moving on from DP. Okay, so this is an interesting coalition. The one member of the coalition is the Hoon Party, which the blog has also, there's a lot of content about them. So these folks are, a lot of them are younger, a lot of them are educated in Japan and Germany, and they make that a really prominent part of their platforms. They're very highly educated. So there's a lot about technology, and it's above and beyond the language and other platforms, and human development, justice, social democracy. Okay, next slide. Oh, also the Mongolian Social Democratic Party, which is, of course, you know, Babur's party. And he's put out a sort of list of endorsements, which you can learn more about on the blog, which includes many of the members of this party, or this coalition. Yeah, so again, they start out with a lot about education, actually. And again, they are language about technology. Some of it's found in the other platforms. So in the other platforms, you'll find like innovation and like accelerating the technology, and what's another, startups. There's some interesting new Mongolian terms I learned for startup, and just startup is in there. But this Right Person Electorate Coalition is like going a step beyond. Like they're talking about fintech, and others are also talking about blockchain, but they're talking a lot about blockchain and providing high-speed internet. They're pretty specific with with the kinds of technology they want to implement. And I would even say like half of their platform, so like out of 30 some pages, is literally like what sorts of technological stuff they want to implement. Okay, and then they do have a fairly lengthy thing at the end about environment, and there's a little bit about, there's actually not that much about rural development. What they do have, there is kind of we're ecological and how can we do ecological sustainable development. But yeah, I would say the focus is really on implementing new technologies and educating people to use those technologies and infrastructure like high-speed internet. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so this right person slogan they have is interesting, right? Because they're definitely kind of playing on that to be like, elect the right person. But then their platform is to develop Mongolian persons in the right way too, right? So again, a lot of this is pretty familiar from other platforms, but these guys are really, really stepping it up in terms of the technology and the education and that sort of stuff. And they also have the economic stuff. I'm going to let BATBOLD talk about that because BATBOLD's going to do a comparison of the mining mining stuff. Okay, and so before I turn it over to him, just a little bit more. So the other coalitions, the big ones are the NPRP, Civil Will, Green Party have a coalition, and they also, the other coalition that's big is called Shin, and that's interesting because it includes Atsanden and Lou Bold, the prominent folks from the DP, who were also involved in those recent protests about a year ago. I found it notable that these other coalitions, you know, they have the familiar language about let's amp up our agricultural production and export it, and of course a lot of language about tradition and supporting that. But they're actually talking a lot about like forestry and like let's develop that, and it's kind of almost as an alternative to mining. And I didn't see anything in any of these other, either the coalitions or the third parties about COVID-19. It's just totally absent. Okay, next slide, please. So then just a couple of other points. So the NPRP, Otgonbayar is, he was actually rejected to be a candidate, and I haven't heard that he appealed or anything. But he's going around campaigning, and his son is a candidate. Some of the stuff in the platform is definitely very familiar from his administration. In terms of herder development, they're actually saying that party is like, we're gonna like build infrastructure for herders, so like winter camp buildings and things like that. They're calling for the distribution of shares of mining wealth. They want to renegotiate the OT agreement. So some of this is also definitely familiar from the presidential elections, their candidate. And they also were talking about this double-chambered parliament idea, which you can also read more about on the blog. That was a recent idea when they were talking about constitutional amendments. And that was also interesting because one of these houses would be, basically parties would give representatives. So it's sort of like, it would be like, one of the chambers would be for the parties to be represented, and then the other chamber would be like directly elected from the people. So anyway, so again, this other coalition, the new coalition, there's a requirement for budgets to pass. They want like banks to be more publicly traded. They talked about like guaranteeing Mongolians abroad the right to vote, which I only saw on that one platform. Doesn't mean it's not on other platforms, but I didn't see it. And they talked a lot about logistics centers at the borders, which was something I saw in some of the other coalitions and third parties, but not in the main parties. And they also, like the MPP, had these like, they had like a list of every IMIG and like what we're gonna do in every single IMIG. So that was interesting. Okay, one more slide for me. So just a little bit more about these third parties. So I've done a few blog posts about, one of them is called the Demos Party, which is interesting because it's running mostly women and younger people, and they're running a candidate in every single riding, including the rural ones. And then the other one I've sort of been following is one called Ate Oze, and they're associated somehow with one of the groups that was part of those protests in the winter of like 2019, where they were erecting the gears. There's a Gare District Development Party, which only has a few people, but is kind of prominent. Anyway, so these guys, the thing that really struck out to me about their platforms is they were talking a lot more about giving like small businesses in the sense of like family businesses. And one of them actually used the term family businesses. So very small, like direct loans to almost individual citizens was sort of how they were tackling the SME problem. And apartment loans, but again, it was much more sort of a direct to the people kind of approach to the financing. But they didn't really talk at all about how to actually get the mining wealth into these funds or into the state budget. They didn't include as much of this sort of new language about startups, accelerators. There wasn't much about human rights. And they were more direct at sort of using terms like oligarch. A couple of them talked about Manen, but that was pretty rare. So that was some unique aspects of the third party platforms. And I think that's all I have. So I'll turn it over to BATBOLD, and he will talk much more in depth about these. How do we get the mining wealth into the into distribution and so forth?
Hello, everybody. My name is BATBOLD. I'm now in Germany, and I will present briefly about mining policy. Me and my colleague Arun Tuya, we published 2 days ago or 1 day ago the post about comparing party election platforms, mining policy at the Mongolia focus. And I will make briefly from this post today. Maybe you know that all the 13 parties and 4 coalitions have at least one promise or statement about mining. And it's interesting, we have collected all statements or promises from the parties, and it is altogether is 15 pages, and it's the long document, and we analyze from that document chosen 3 parties, DP and MPP, and the right person, the electorate Zuhung is the coalition. And the interesting one more the aspect is not aspect thing is that the MPP has the longest list of the promises on the mining. You can find in different part of the platform. It's not just in the mining, it's also in the rural area, and it's very different part of the platform. And except for small parties, all parties have about the statements about the sovereign wealth funds. It's regarding that the Mongolian constitution change. It's into force on 25th of May this year, and the like party, Green Party, has 2 pages just about these sovereign wealth funds, how it function, it's how will they established, who is responsible, how build the fund structure, and it's very interesting. But all parties have some ideas and some statements on that. We focused on 4 main topics. It's mostly all of parties have statements on that. The first one is exploration. Second one is sovereign wealth funds. And the next one is the proceeds from mining projects and strategic deposits. These 4 topics, I will present the first 2 aspects today. But the third and fourth, I will just mention briefly. Okay, then you can see the pictures. This picture is by Batdorj. He is a photographer in Mongolia, and he has really good pictures, and he is working for Gamma agency in Mongolia. And you can see in the first picture, it's the MPP candidates, and they around the people you can see all have this mask. It's just on the street. It's not the party, the event or some. Yeah. Next slide, please. And here you can see the DP candidates. It's a party event and it's a meeting, and the candidates sitting on the right side of the board. But you can see it's just some expression. It's always blue. You can know the DP color. It's the chair is also blue. That's the interesting thing. Okay, now we are going to the exploration. It's you can see from these statements, it's MPP will not change what they are doing now. It's you can see what's the this year, last year, this year, it's they stopped the exploration license giving, and but DP has very different suggestion or the promise or statement this year. It's they will directly they stated there's source of revenues. No, it's I'm wrong. The DP the resolve once and for all the issues faced in the exploration and prospecting, and immediately launch geological exploration. They will support the start, and also they will change the mining law, and MPP will they will do what last 2 or 3 years it's focused, and they will only do exploration works conducted by government budget funds. That means it will stay by the state. It's not for foreign or for private in the investment. That's you can see in the platform. And Zuhung party, the Zuhung coalition, it's not mentioned about the especially on the exploration, but they promise to ensure they establish for investment in mining sector, and their platform mostly emphasize the private sector role and responsibility and attracting foreign investment. That's which only stand out construct to the MPP, and that's the different of Hun party, Zuhung coalition. Next slide, please, BULGAN. And next topic is sovereign wealth funds, and you can get a lot of information from these parties' platforms. And here's this the I mentioned about this the constitutional amendments which came into force on 25th May this year, and it's legalized to the principle to consolidate benefits of the mineral resource in the National Sovereign Fund and ensure fair distribution. And all parties, it's mentioned about that, and but it's different. You can see some parties in the program. It's at the platform. It's mentioned about the amounts, the amounts, and how they're financing and what they will distribute this money. It's some points is similar, DP and MPP, and also the Zuhung coalition, because they will use this money for National Housing Corporation, and also they will use also different kind of new funds, especially the MPP has newfound ideas. They increase the benefits for Mongolia from Oyu Tolgoi and other mining projects and establish social responsibility fund to support individuals with low and middle income, and also some SME support. And it's one thing what we had 2 years ago, this SME fund scandal, and because of that we have should be carry out how we get these funds. If you have more new funds, it's the distribution, it's scandal, corruption, and all those aspects. And in that regard, the DP, the Democratic Party, has a little bit difference, that they directly state to the source of revenues to be pooled into sovereign wealth fund, which is from the royalties. And they said also the royalties shall be separated from the state budget revenue, and only 5% will remain in the budget. And the rest will be pooled into sovereign wealth fund, and the specialist the organization shall manage the fund. That means they will have the special organization, or it's not mentioned about, it's private or it's public, and it's not mentioned about here, but they establish the separate organization. They will manage the fund. And but here's the interesting aspect is the Mongolian budget depends on the but the mining revenue is this 25% of the Mongolian state budget, the income. And if they take from that so big amounts, and then how the Mongolian Mongolia will finance the other aspects, and how they will get more income for this gap, fill this gap. And that's also the DP is mentioned about local distribution. They will set up system for direct distribution to the local areas of up to 30% of revenues from the natural resource collected at the state budget. It's also how they will do that. It's important issue because of mining companies and local areas all wants to get more money from the mining projects, but the last 2 years or 3 years it was not easy to distribute to the local the budget revenues, but they will add more promise to this aspect. And Zuhung coalition declared just we put that this is not just one sentence, it's we bring different sentences, and they declared only the right economic policy shall ensure that natural resource benefits for everyone. The stability of savings fund shall be expanded, and also fair distribution of wealth, equal opportunities and conditions for each individual shall be ensured. In general, the coalition platform has the characteristic of concepts stating general principles and approach, and that's a little bit different than the other two parties. It's not exact some percent or some ideas or the activity, but the overall ideas, and maybe they have activities or projects already, and that's the difference from these two parties. And you can see the picture. It's in Hangul district and in Ger area, and also photo by Rensendorj, and it's the first 3 candidates is from the Zuhun coalition, and you can see others. And my colleague Daruntuya said she's at the moment very happy go to the street because it's so kindly persons you can meet every day at the street, and they greet you, and that's the one of them. This street, if you go through that. And next to aspects is I don't have any slides, but you can see that in our article or post. It's about the percents from mining project and also the strategic projects. And Melissa mentioned about some the big mega projects to the lead to development, MPP, and it's Saran Sobrak, Harmakta, and Askat and Selhit, and that's a lot of projects. The all parties will, especially DP and the MPP, will would like to start. But one aspect, it's strange that Katsor project, which was registered as a strategic deposit and always included in the government action plan since 2008, is not mentioned at all in this time, which just one small party, it's in that program, it's about Gachur, and all other parties ignore this project, and that's the one interesting thing. And proceeds from mining projects, it's of course it's all three political, these three players compared, they have promised to develop heavy industries in the coming 4 years, which would be something unseen for the last 30 years. The most that's maybe it's if we see the some party program, they have long list. We can have next 4 years, if the party win, then every 3 months new industry, the new the industry park will be open, and it's a very big industrial development for next 4 years. Now I'm going to just briefly conclusion for the this part of the mining policy. It's because the all parties, it's the Mongolia still depends on the mining and the mining sector, and because of all parties given big attention to this sector, and also they have interesting aspects, and all will continue mining, and mostly is same except exploration licensing, and other this heavy industry and the strategic project, and it's all mostly similar. And MPP released on the achievement of its previous government promoting to save the failing economy, and DP is the mostly so focusing on mistake and works carried out by MPP for last 4 years. And the right person electorate, the Zhou coalition is to ensure the stability of foreign and domestic investment, and work to attract more investment. It's of the three parties briefly our conclusion. Thank you.
Terrific, Batdorj and Marissa, thank you very much. It's good to really get a substantive view on what's being proposed and what this election is being fought over. So we've got 12 days left. The election, of course, is on June 24th. So we're halfway through the campaign. Nothing in particular concerning in terms, everyone's always talking about electoral fraud. I talked about this as perennial distractions last time already. One of the things that's going to be different, of course, because of the global pandemic, is there's no international observation effort, no organized effort at least. A number of the embassies have already said that they're not observing, in part because they just don't think that they have the resources to do a whole lot, and therefore don't want to lend their name to something that they can't actually certify in any way. But of course, as always, we have a very big domestic observation effort. So the party observers will be out in force, and there's also a number of NGOs that have been registered as domestic observers. One of the big questions, of course, will be turnout. Bjamjaf and Gerrit wrote a post yesterday on the blog speculating a little bit about what impact young voters in particular might have if they turn out. We had a post last week by Bodsachen, who also talked a bit about why and how young voters think. So this will matter significantly, I think. We've mentioned a bunch of posts. We're all gonna keep an eye on the election. Hopefully you keep an eye on the blog as one of your sources. We're gonna do a panel. I'm gonna be on a panel at the Australian National University next Friday at a time that's a bit more convenient for folks based in Asia. And we're always gonna keep tweeting about these matters as well. And so hopefully you'll have a chance to follow all of that. We might do an event just before the election again like this, otherwise just after or a week after for analysis. Follow us on Twitter and you'll see announcements of what exactly we'll come up with.